Hey there, welcome back. I'm really glad you're here. Okay, so there have been some rumors of a slight softening in the market. Have you heard any of that? I'm getting a lot of questions about market conditions, and so I want to kind of take you through what's happening here in our local market. I also want to bring in some points of negotiation that went away for a few years, but are starting to make themselves seen in offers recently as a result of current market conditions. So let's get into it. So if we compare 2022 to where we are in 2023, there are some pretty interesting market dynamics. Everyone knows the market went a little bananas for a few years. I'm going to give you a 4-year deep dive in a future video, but that's outside the scope of what we're looking at today. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be interesting. Okay, so for the sake of comparison, we are today going to look at the last week of June of 2022 and the last week of June of this year in 2023. How has the market changed? What does it mean? And then we're going to talk about some of the negotiation pieces that are kind of making their way back into the conversation. So first, let's talk about active inventory. June of 22, we had 229 active residential listings. The last week of June 23, we had 211. It's worth noting that those numbers both are higher than what we had in 2020 and 2021. So why does it feel like there's not enough inventory? Well, because our community is growing and there are more people out there in our market. Here's an interesting fact for you. Our June 22 median list price was $460,000. Our median list price, June of 23, was $472,000. Higher median list price year over year. Hang tight, I've got more interesting stuff for you. Here's something that I didn't really realize until I did a deep dive into these sales numbers in our market. So at the end of June of 22, our 6-month sold amount, the number of homes sold in the previous 6 months was 489. Okay. The number of homes sold in the previous 6 months prior to the end of June 23 this year was 362. You guys, that is a 26% reduction in the number of homes sold in that 6-month period year over year. That's a pretty significant drop from where we've been. You would think that the market would respond maybe with some price drops in response to the number of transactions that dropped or was reduced. Well, because we still have such a high demand, and we've talked about this a lot, the market is just not coming down like some people were predicting. I was not one of those people, by the way. You know this. I've been consistent in saying that the market will not do what it did in 2008 because of several factors, the most important one being lower supply of homes and increased demand. I will get on that soapbox later. We'll save that for a future video. Okay, so we talked about our median list prices. Guess where our median sales prices were? You know, you don't have to guess. I'm going to tell you. This is really interesting. Okay, so the last week of June of 22, median sales price was $387,000. June of 23, it was $362,000, or a 5.6% drop. Of course, prices went up a bunch from 2020, so that reduction in the median sales price maybe doesn't feel very significant. I believe it is opening up the door for some different elements to the contracts that we're writing and receiving. So let's talk about those in terms of concessions and negotiations. So back when the market was in such a frenzy, the buyers who were getting the contracts on homes, you know this, were largely those who could just throw the most money at a deal. Although the market is still tight, I'm seeing that sellers are maybe willing to pay some closing costs, maybe negotiate buy down of points, and buyers have the ability to ask for some concessions. Sellers still have such a tremendous amount of equity in their homes that they are starting to be willing to talk about some of these negotiations and some of these concessions. So one of the concessions I wanted to talk about is the time clause, sometimes referred to as a kickout clause. Because the market was so bananas for a few years, this tool sort of went away. I'm actually starting to see it be used more frequently, and I want to make sure that you guys have a clear understanding of what it is and what it's not, how it's used, because I've had several contracts in the last few months with this addendum attached. So If a buyer has a concession to ask of the seller that's outside of the typical things like due diligence, financing, appraisal, the things that we see very, very often in contracts, this is an addendum that can be used. For example, if the buyer has a house they need to sell first, the offer on the purchase can be negotiated with a contingency to sell the buyer's house. If the seller agrees to this contingency, typically there is also this addendum negotiated into the contract called the time clause or a kickout clause. Or for those of us who used these back in the old days, we used to actually call them a 72-hour clause or a 72-hour kickout clause. But they're usually referred to as a kickout clause or a time clause now. Okay, so this clause allows the seller to continue to market the property and seek buyers. If another buyer successfully negotiates a backup offer, the seller then has a specific number of days to notify the buyer in primary position that there is a backup offer. At that point, the primary buyer has a specific amount of time to either affirm or withdraw the contingency. If the contingency is affirmed, meaning the buyer cannot move forward without selling the house in this case, then that primary buyer steps aside and becomes the backup offer. The new backup offer then becomes the primary offer. Now, if the primary offer removes that contingency, then all other terms of the contract remain. The dates are the same, other contingencies are the same, everything else in the contract remains as it was negotiated in that primary offer. So this is one of the biggest changes I've seen come back into our contract negotiations in the last few months. As we mentioned earlier, I'm also seeing some slight price negotiations and more sellers willing to contribute to buyers' closing costs, loan fees, buy downs, and so forth. This market continues to cause all of us to adapt, be educated, and have good professionals on our side. Please let me know in the comments if you have questions about what is happening today in our market. Thanks for being here. We'll see you soon.